I shuffle out of the hospital's emergency wing at 2 in the morning, the hallway lights buzzing like tired insects. The air smells of antiseptic and cheap coffee that the night shift nurses keep brewing in a dented thermos. My coat's hem brushes the slick tiles, leaving faint prints that dry in the low humidity. Outside, the wind whips through the downtown streets, rattling the metal awnings and sending a shiver up my spine. I pull the hood of my navy hoodie tighter, feeling the weight of the bag slung over my shoulder, a battered backpack stuffed with a half-finished chemistry homework, a worn copy of *The Alchemist*, and a crumpled flyer for a scholarship I've been chasing for months. The sky is a flat, bruised gray, and the first flakes of snow begin to drift down, each one landing on the slick concrete and dissolving into a thin, oily film. I glance at my phone. The battery icon blinks a frantic orange, a reminder that I'm 3 hours away from my mother's cramped apartment where the roof leaks whenever the rain hits hard. My rent is due next week, and the hospital's night shift bonus isn't enough to cover the extra water damage. I can't afford another emergency. None of them can wait for a breakup. The curb is lined with a few stranded cars, their hoods steaming in the cold. I glide my fingers over the metal of the silver Kia, feeling the frost bite my fingertips, and then the familiar click of the rideshare app buzzing on my screen. No drivers nearby, it says, the text glaring in the dark. I sigh, the sound swallowed by the distant wail of a siren and the hollow thump of a garbage truck passing an hour ago. My stomach growls, a low reminder that I skipped dinner to pull a double shift. I pull a granola bar from my pocket, the plastic wrapper crackling as I break it in half, and I bite into the stale oat, the sugar coating turning to grit on my tongue. A black SUV rolls into the lot, its headlights cutting through the fog like twin swords. It's the kind of car that could belong to a CEO or a movie star, the paint so glossy it reflects the flares of street lamps as if they were constellations. The driver's side door is ajar, a thin line of darkness against the interior's faint amber glow. I pause, eyes scanning, half expecting to see a rideshare driver slumped over a laptop. No one's inside, just the empty seat that seems to beckon weary travelers with a promise of warmth. I step up, the heel of my boot clicking against the concrete, and slide the door open. The leather seat smells faintly of rain on asphalt, a scent that makes my throat tighten. I fold the seat back and lower myself into the passenger side, the upholstery sighing under my weight. My coat settles around me, the fabric brushing the dash, and I push the door shut, the soft thud echoing in the quiet garage. A shiver runs down my spine, not from the cold, but from the high-pitched hum of the engine as it idles, a low purr that feels oddly reassuring. "Hey, you all right?" a voice says, low and unexpectedly familiar. It's not the smooth, polished tone you hear in press releases. It's a husky baritone tinged with an accent I can't place, half West Coast, half something older, like the echo of a cabin in the woods. It's the kind of voice you hear on campus rumors, the one that gets whispered when students talk about the mysterious heir to cross industries, the man who supposedly runs his company with a claw-like grip and never shows up for a dinner party. I glance over, catching a glimpse of a man in his late 20s, his profile half lit by the dashboard. He's tall, shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, and his jaw is set in a line that looks sculpted from stone. He wears a dark shirt that clings to his torso just enough to hint at the muscles underneath, and a black leather jacket hangs loosely over his broad shoulders. His hair is cropped short, the side neatly shaved while the top is slightly longer, giving him an effortless edge. A faint scar traces the curve of his left cheek, just barely visible where the light catches it. He steps back into the driver's seat, his hand moving to grip the steering wheel. The leather is warm, pressed against his palm, and a faint scent of pine sap and leather drifts from him, mingling with the metallic odor of the car. I notice his fingers are calloused, the knuckles slightly bruised, as if he's used to handling more than just a steering wheel. The movement of his wrist is precise, each motion deliberate, a rhythm that suggests control. "Wrong car," he says, his eyes flicking to the rear-view mirror. where my reflection sits faintly against the darkness. My own face is a mess of fatigue, raccoon eyes from the night shift, a stray strand of dark hair fallen over my forehead. I tug the hood back up, feeling the wool of the fabric against my cheek, and force a smile that doesn't quite reach my eyes. Yeah, my mistake, I reply, my voice matching the tremor in my throat. I thought it was a rideshare. I glance at the dashboard, the digital clock blinking 2:13 am in stark red. My breath fogs the glass in quick, shaky puffs, each exhale a small cloud that dissipates like a secret. He doesn't say anything about the car's automation or why the door was open. He just nods, his gaze lingering a fraction longer on the window pane, as if weighing whether to let me out into the storm. The wind huffs against the garage's iron doors, a whistling that makes the old concrete walls vibrate. Should we? I start, but the words catch in my throat. My mind races back to the stack of textbooks waiting for me in the dorm lobby, the looming tuition bill, the promise I made to my mother that I'd get a scholarship and get us out of this basement. I can feel the weight of my responsibilities like a chain around my neck, each link forged from her sacrifices and my own relentless grind. His hand tightens on the wheel. You can see his knuckles whiten. He leans back, the seat creaking under his shift. You can't go out there, he says, and the words are not a threat but a warning. The tone is low, almost protective, but there's a flicker of something else, perhaps amusement, perhaps something I can't name. The storm's picking up. It's not safe to walk alone. The phrase safe hits a chord. My life is built on safety nets, night shifts, a steady paycheck, the promise of a future where I won't have to rely on anyone else. Yet here, in this cramped SUV, the idea of a stranger offering protection feels like a trap, an invitation to become indebted. I swallow, feeling the granola bar crumble in my palm, the crumbs falling onto my jeans. I've got a bus ticket, I say, the lie slipping out as easily as breath. It'll be downtown in. The bus isn't running, not with the snow. He glances at the windshield, where thin sheets of white are already beginning to cling to the glass, the flurries ticking like a metronome. You're going to be stuck here for a while. I glance at the GPS flickering on the dash. The map shows a red line of traffic snarling around the downtown area, a sea of orange cones and stalled cars. The garage is a tunnel of concrete, the fluorescent lights above flickering in a half-beat rhythm. My stomach knots tighter, a cold knot that's not just the weather. A beat passes, and I can hear the low growl of the engine, a subtle vibration that travels through the seat, up into my thighs. The SUV shudders slightly as a car outside sputters, the sound muffled but their metal grinding against metal, the occasional screech of tires. His eyes meet mine again, this time with a hint of curiosity, like a hunter watching a rabbit shyly step into a brush. You're not from around here? He asks, the question more a statement. There's no malice, just an interest that feels invasive and oddly intimate. I shake my head, my hair catching on my hood. Seattle's home, I answer, the words feeling too light. I work at the hospital, St. Joseph's, 3rd floor, night shift. You? He stays silent for a moment, the engine's hum filling the space between us. I can hear the faint ticking of the clock on the dash, each second a reminder that I'm standing on the edge of a decision that could tilt the rest of my night and maybe more into an unknown direction. A siren wails somewhere far off, its echo bouncing off the concrete walls, a reminder that the city never truly sleeps. The snow outside starts to thicken, the flakes now larger, turning the world outside the garage into a white blur. A gust of wind pushes through the half-open garage door, carrying a metallic tang of rust and the distant smell of pine from a neighboring park. He finally speaks, his voice softer, almost as if he's aware that any louder tone would pierce the thin veil of vulnerability that I'm desperately trying to keep intact. You can stay in the car until the garage reopens. It's warmer in here than outside. The offer hangs in the air, a simple act that feels like a lifeline. I look at the seatbelt, the small metal clasp gleaming under the flickering light. My mind flips through the possibilities: stay, risk freezing and maybe get caught in a snowdrift, or step out into the night, slip on the icy pavement, and risk an even worse fate. My mother's face flickers in my head, her tired eyes, the water stain on the ceiling where the leak had already started to spread, the way she always said she trusted me to make the right choices. I bite my lip, feeling the dry skin on the inside of the corner of my mouth, and finally lean back, letting the seat cradle me. Fine. My voice is barely a whisper, swallowed by the engine's low drone. He clicks the seatbelt, the click sounding like a tiny gunshot. The buckle slides into place with a subtle click, the metal warm against my skin. His hand brushes the edge of the seat as he adjusts his own belt, the contact fleeting but electric, a jolt that makes the hair on my arms stand up. "Name's Liam," he says, not offering his last name. The way he says it feels like a hand reaching across a chasm, both invitation and warning. "Ava," I reply, the name feeling foreign on my own tongue when spoken aloud. I glance out the windshield. The world is now a whiteout, the streetlights looking like distant fireflies drowned in a sea of snow. He nods, his profile framed by the soft glow of the dashboard. "We'll get through this." Snow's a lousy excuse for making us stay stuck somewhere with strangers, but it works. There's something in his eyes, a flicker of amusement that quickly hardens into a mask of practicality. I notice a flash of tension in his jaw, a subtle clench as if he's holding something back, a secret that sits just beneath the surface of his polished exterior. He presses the accelerator a fraction, and the SUV's engine growls louder, the sound vibrating through the metal and into my bones. The garage door hisses as it slides shut, sealing us inside. The fluorescent lights buzz louder, strobing in a rhythm that feels like a heartbeat. The snow presses harder against the glass, turning the world beyond the windshield into a monochrome blur. I pull my hoodie tighter, feeling the soft wool against my skin, a comfort that reminds me of my mother's old scarf she kept folded in the spare drawer. The scent of pine from his cologne mixes with the faint ozone of the car's exhaust, creating an odd, grounding aroma that makes the cold less biting. I stare at the rearview mirror, watching his profile for a second longer, the way his eyes linger just a beat too long on the road ahead, as if searching for something beyond the snow, maybe an exit, maybe a sign that this night won't end in a crash. A thought surfaces, half-formed, that maybe this forced proximity could be an opportunity, but the warning bells in my head crackle louder. Help, my mind mutters, means debt, means reliance, means losing the little control I have left. He turns his head, catching my gaze. A tiny smile tugs at the corner of his mouth, one that doesn't reach his eyes. "You look like you've been through a lot, Ava," he says, the words landing gently, like a feather on a window pane. He doesn't ask about my mother, my job, my scholarship. He just sees something in me that's both strength and fragility. I let out a short, humorless laugh, the sound echoing off the ceiling. "You could say that." The snow outside thickens, the world becoming a muffled white, the sound of the storm a low hum that competes with the engine's roar. We sit in silence for a moment, the air thick with unspoken questions. I can feel the tension in his shoulders, the subtle way his fingers tap on the steering wheel, a rhythm that's almost a pulse. My own heartbeat drums in my ears, louder than the gale outside. My mind drifts to the scholarship deadline, the looming threat of failure, and the weight of my mother's reliance on me. I can't afford to be distracted, can't afford to let anyone see the cracks. Yet the space beside me, the warmth of the car, the surprising closeness feel like a trap I'm reluctant to step into. I glance at the tiny digital display on the dash. It shows the temperature, 28 degrees, the wind chill factor dropping to a number I can't quite read against the snowfall. My phone buzzes, an email notification from the university, the subject line, scholarship application, deadline approaching. I stare at it, the glow of the screen reflecting off the wet surface of the windshield, the letters flickering like a warning light. He notices his gaze flicking to the screen. You have a deadline? He asks, voice low, not mocking, just curious. I nod, the words feeling heavy. Yeah, need to get a recommendation letter, hospital supervisor said. He interrupts, a faint chuckle escaping him. You're working nights to pay the rent, trying to get a scholarship, and now you're stuck in my car because a storm decided to ruin your life. Talk about a Tuesday. I flash a smile that's more defensive than sincere. You could say that. He turns the key, the engine's growl dropping to a low idle. The SUV's heater kicks in, a gentle hiss of warm air blowing through the vents, the scent of vanilla from a faint aftershave finding its way into the cabin. The temperature rises a few degrees, the frost on the windows melting into droplets that slide down like tiny rivers. The moment stretches, a pause filled with the sound of snow pounding the garage roof, the occasional distant clang of a metal gate being forced open somewhere else, and the soft whir of the car's fans. I feel the pressure building, a knot tightening in my chest, not just from the cold but from the realization that I'm now sharing a confined space with someone whose world is a mystery. I've only heard rumors about a man who walks boardrooms like battlefields, who likely has secrets longer than the alleyways of this city. A thought flickers, what if I could use this time? What if I could get that letter from a hospital supervisor by proving I'm capable of handling pressure? But the price is staying here, listening to him, maybe even trusting him. My gut tightens, the feeling of an invisible rope pulling me in two directions. It's a familiar tug, the same one that has kept me from letting anyone get close for years. Liam's hand rests lightly on the gear shift, his fingers tracing the contours as if feeling for something underneath. He looks over at me, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if measuring how much of myself I'm willing to reveal. You know, he says, voice softer now, I have a place nearby where you could get a warm coffee, something to keep you awake for that essay. The offer lands like a stone in a pond, the ripples spreading outward. I think of the cold air waiting outside, the empty kitchen at home, the cheap instant noodles waiting in the pantry. A warm cup of coffee could be a small relief, a moment of normalcy, yet accepting it would mean stepping out, stepping into whatever the storm has left behind, and risking slipping on the ice. I stare at the cup holder, the empty space where a mug could sit, the metal glinting under the dashboard light. My hand hovers over the steering wheel, feeling the coolness of the leather, the faint imprint of his thumb on the edge. I can hear the soft crackle of the heater, the low thrum of the engine, the distant howl of wind outside. I exhale, a breath that fogs the interior a little before disappearing. Maybe later, I say, the words lingering, unfinished, as if hoping they'll buy me more time. I don't know how many hours we'll be stuck, or what the storm will bring, but I know this night is already shifting, the balance of control slipping just enough for something new to slip through. The garage door shudders as a gust of wind forces a thin metal panel open a crack, the sound like a sigh. In the corner of my mind, a question forms, a thread that will keep tugging at me long after the snow melts. Who is the man in the black SUV really, and what does he want from a tired student who's already carrying a world on her shoulders? The answer stays hidden, like the snow-covered streets beyond the glass, waiting for the storm to pass. I stare at the fogged glass, the world outside a muffled blur of white, and try not to think about how many times I've promised myself I'd never let anyone in. The heater hums low, a soft thrum that vibrates through the seat and makes my shoulders lift a fraction, as if the car itself is breathing. Liam shifts his weight, the leather creaking beneath him, and a thin line of condensation slides down the side of the windshield where his fingertip brushed it a moment ago. Coffee's gone cold on the counter, he says, voice still low but edged with something that sounds like curiosity. He reaches for the thermos on the cup holder, the metal slick with a thin film of frost. I watch his hand pause, then pull the lid off, a sigh of steam escaping and mixing with the pine-scented cologne that clings to his skin. The vapor curls around his jaw, catching the light from the dashboard and making his scar look like a faint river of old blood. I take a sip, the dark liquid burning my throat, the bitterness pulling at the edge of my focus. I can taste the smoke from the city's exhaust riding in the air, a reminder that we're not in a cabin in the woods. Even if his scent tries to tell a different story, my fingers curl around the cup, the ceramic warm against my palm, and I feel a tremor travel up my arm, not from the cold, but from the way his eyes flicked to me as I lifted the cup, the way he seemed to measure how long I'd stay still. "You good?" he asks, and the question lands between us like a dropped stone in a frozen pond. The surface cracks, and for a split second I see my own reflection, the tired eyes, the hood pulled too low, the scar of a sleepless night stamped across my cheeks. I swallow, feeling the lump in my throat tighten. "Just the old habit of not trusting strangers," I reply, the words slipping out dry like the crumbs that still cling to my jeans. I glance at the seatbelt buckle, its metal glinting red against the dark seat, a reminder that I'm tied in more ways than one. He doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he slides the thermos back into the holder, the motion deliberate, the metal clinking against the plastic. A low growl rumbles from the engine, a sound that vibrates through the floorboards and seems to echo the animal hidden somewhere behind his calm exterior. I catch a flash of something, an amber glint in his eyes, a hint of wildness that makes the hair on my forearms rise. "Ever been stuck in a garage during a snowstorm?" he asks, half joking, half testing the water. I let out a short laugh that feels brittle, like ice cracking on a pond. "Once," I say, and the memory slides in unbidden, a busted radiator on a road trip, the smell of coolant mixing with pine needles, the way a stray dog had crawled under the car and stared at us with big, pleading eyes. There was a mutt that wouldn't stop barking at the night. I gave it some of my sandwich, and it followed me to the next town. He leans back, the seat sighing under his weight, and the scent of pine grows stronger, as if the car's interior were breathing in the forest. "Sounds like you're good with animals," he observes, his tone softer now, as if he were sharing a secret rather than cataloging a fact. I feel a flicker of something, perhaps the urge to prove I'm more than a student who can't afford a warm cup. "I can fix things," I say, gesturing to the laptop in my bag. A busted laptop is just a paperclip and a lot of patience. He raises an eyebrow, the scar catching a shaft of light and glinting like a warning. "Patience is a rare commodity in my line of work," he says. He doesn't elaborate, but the way his jaw tightens tells me there's more under the surface: dealings, contracts, maybe a boardroom that smells of stale leather and copper wire. A fragment of a black envelope slides between his fingers for a heartbeat, then disappears, leaving only a faint scent of ozone. I don't know what it was, but the mystery settles in my chest, a knot I can't quite untie. We sit in silence for a moment, the SUV's heater buzzing, the snow pounding the roof in a steady rhythm, each tap like a metronome marking time we cannot escape. My phone buzzes again, a notification flashing on the cracked screen. "Package delayed, ups." I glance at the screen, the number of unread messages a reminder that life is still happening outside these four seats. I thumb the notification, but the message fades as quickly as it appears, leaving me with the lingering scent of damp metal and my own breath. "What's the package?" Liam asks, eyes flicking to the glow of the screen, then back to me. I hesitate, the words caught somewhere between truth and the need to keep my walls up. "Nothing I'm excited about," I say, and the lie feels like a thin veil, almost transparent. "Just some equipment for the hospital. Makes the night shift easier." He nods, the motion smooth, almost rehearsed. "I get that," he says. "I have shipments too, some delicate items that need extra care." His hand rests on the gear shift, fingers tracing the outline of a small, engraved emblem, a wolf's head entwined with a steel cog. The metal is cold to the touch, yet somehow it seems to pulse with a low, almost inaudible hum. A sudden shudder runs through the SUV as a distant clang reverberates from the garage floor. Something has shifted on the concrete, a metal shelf perhaps giving way under the weight of snow that has found its way inside. The lights flicker, casting the interior in intermittent amber and darkness. I feel the car tilt ever so slightly, the seatback pressing into my back, the faint smell of rust rising from the floorboards. "Did you hear that?" I ask, voice barely above a whisper because the sound of my own breath seems louder than the storm outside. He looks ahead, eyes narrowing, and a low rumble escapes his throat, part growl, part warning. The sound is unplaceable, but it vibrates through the steel frame, making the seatbelt buckle vibrate against my skin. My heart hammers against my ribs, not just from the noise but from the proximity of his presence, the way his shoulder brushes against mine whenever the car lurches. "Stay still," he says, and the command lands with a weight that feels both protective and possessive. He reaches for the door, the metal cold under his palm, and pulls it open a crack. A gust of icy wind rushes in, carrying the scent of wet concrete and a faint metallic tang that makes my nose tingle. Snow spirals in, clinging to the edge of the door like tiny crystals of glass. I watch the flakes settle on his forearm, the way they cling to the scar, making it look like a map of old wounds. A stray thought pops up, something about a rival pack, a name whispered in a hallway I've yet to see, Mara, and a threat that could ruin everything he's built. The name hangs in the air, a fragment I can't quite place, but it adds a pressure to the moment, like the crushing weight of snow on a roof. He closes the door with a soft thud, the seal sealing us back into a pocket of heat. The heater steadies, the air filling with the faint roast of coffee and the lingering pine. I feel the tension in his shoulders ease just enough for his hand to find the armrest, his fingers brushing the fabric of my hoodie. The contact is brief, but the electric hum that travels through my sleeve is undeniable. "Help me with the laptop later?" he asks, his tone casual, as if he's asking about a spare battery. I'm not great with tech, and I could use a second pair of eyes. I glance at the device nestled in my bag, its screen cracked at the corner like a scar on my own story. The thought of fixing it with him, two strangers sharing a cramped space, each offering a piece of themselves, feels absurd and oddly comforting. I tug the hoodie tighter, the wool against my skin reminding me of my mother's hands, and I let the minor agreement slip out. Sure, might as well make the most of being stuck. He smiles, the line of his mouth moving just enough to let a hint of his teeth show, and the scar on his cheek catches the light in a way that makes it look less like a wound and more like a badge. "All right, we'll figure it out together." The SUV rumbles back to life, the engine purring as it settles into a low, steady rhythm. Outside, the snow keeps falling, thickening the white veil that separates us from the rest of the city. Inside, the cabin feels tighter, the air charged with a mix of pine, diesel, and the faint metallic scent of the emblem on his shift knob. I glance at the dashboard clock, 2:27 am, and realize the night has stretched further than I'd anticipated. A distant siren wails, a lonely note slicing through the storm, and for the first time I notice a flicker of anxiety in Liam's eyes, a flash of something beyond the calm he projects. He glances at the rearview mirror, sees his own reflection staring back, a man caught between corporate steel and something wilder, something that wants to claim a human whose scent he's already marked as his. I turn my attention back to the thermos, the coffee cooling in my hand, and feel a small, stubborn smile tug at my lips. The world outside is a white chaos, but here, in the cramped space of a black SUV, the chaos feels more manageable, the unknown a little less frightening. I hear a soft thump from the back of the garage, the sound of a metal cart shifting on the concrete, and I wonder what other secrets the building holds, who else is trapped. What other deals are being sealed in the shadows? We sit, the silence stretching, each of us holding onto the other's presence as if it were a lifeline. The storm rages, the lights flicker, and somewhere far beyond the concrete walls, a rival pack watches, waiting for the moment to strike. But for now, the only thing I can feel is the heat of the seat beneath me, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the faint, lingering promise that maybe, just maybe, this forced proximity could lead somewhere beyond survival. The heater crackled louder as the SUV shuddered on the slick concrete, a low groan echoing from the engine every time a gust slammed the garage door shut. I stared at the steam rising from the coffee, watching the tiny clouds drift across the visor like ghost thin ribbons. Liam's hand rested on the gear shift, fingers tracing the wolf head emblem until the metal warmed under his palm. He didn't look at me, but the way his thumb brushed the scar on his cheek made the light catch it, a fresh line of amber in the dim. "Don't let the cold get to your fingers," he said, voice barely louder than the wind rattling the pillars. He slid the cup holder forward and pressed the cup into my palm, the ceramic heat seeping into my skin. The scent of pine in his cologne rose with each breath, mingling with the metallic tang of the garage floor. I lifted the cup, feeling the weight of it as if it were a promise, and the tiniest tremor ran up my arm when his gaze lingered just a fraction too long. A sudden clang reverberated from the far side of the garage, a metal rack collapsing under the weight of snow. The lights flickered, casting the interior in strobe-like amber and darkness. Liam's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck bulging like a rope pulled taut. He thrust his shoulder forward, the leather seat creaking, and the SUV lurched forward a few inches, the tires grinding against the slick concrete. "Stay right there," he ordered, the words edged with something sharper than caution. He slipped from the driver's seat, the door opening to a rush of icy air that shredded the warm bubble we'd built. Snow swirled into the cabin, landing on his forearm, coating the scar in a thin veil of white. My breath hitched as the frost brushed my cheek, and I felt my own hood dampen, the wool pulling tighter against the chill. He knelt, pulling the small, battered backpack from the floor, his own, I guessed, because the tag read Cross Industries. A rusted key dangled from a strap, its loop catching the faint glow of the emergency lights. He lifted it, then, without a word, pressed the cold metal into my hand. The key was heavier than it looked, its teeth jagged like teeth he'd once shown in a dream I'd never had. "I have a locker down the hall," he said, the syllable locker hanging between us like a secret door. "If we're stuck, we can store anything or anyone." His chuckle was low, almost a growl, and a stray bark sputtered from somewhere deeper, as if a wolf were stirring awake. The moments stretched, the snow hammering the roof in rhythm with my pulse. I could feel the heat from his skin when he brushed past, the faint tremor in his jaw softening just enough for his eyes to meet mine. In that flash, something unspoken passed, a recognition that the proximity was no accident, that the danger outside mirrored the tension coiled inside us. The key clinked against the metal of the seatbelt, a tiny, resonant sound that seemed to echo louder than the storm. Outside, a distant siren wailed, and a muffled voice over a crackling radio mentioned Mara and illegal pack activity. Liam's hand tightened around the knob, his knuckles whitening. He turned back to the passenger seat, his stare lingering on the coffee cup now half empty, the steam rising like a phantom. I felt the weight of the key in my palm, the promise of a locked door, and the sudden, dangerous possibility that the line between protection and possession was already blurring. The heater hissed louder as the SUV settled into a low, steady rumble, the metal frame vibrating with each gust that slammed the garage doors shut. I pressed my forehead against the cool window, watching the snow pile up in jagged drifts outside, the streetlights bending into halos through the white blur. The scent of pine from Liam's cologne mingled with the stale diesel that clung to the seats, a strange comfort that felt like a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. He slid the door open just enough for a breath of icy air to tumble in, then shut it with a soft thud that sealed us back into our tiny haven. The frost that clung to his forearm melted under his thumb, leaving a thin line of water that traced the scar on his cheek. I could have sworn the scar seemed less a wound and more a map of something older, something I couldn't read but was oddly drawn to. "Looks like the lights are going to flicker again," he said, his voice low, the words barely rising above the wind's howl. He tapped the dashboard with a fingertip, and the amber glow sputtered, casting our faces in strobe-like shadows. I watched the light die, then flare back to life, and the brief darkness gave me a chance to notice the way his shoulders relaxed only a fraction when the engine settled. A flicker of something relief maybe crossed his eyes, and for a heartbeat I saw a glimmer of the man behind the boardroom armor, a shape that was half human, half something else. "Want to warm up a bit?" he asked, reaching for the cup holder and pulling out the thermos he'd been cradling earlier. The metal was cold to my fingers, but the steam curled around his face, making the faint flecks of snow on his coat glisten like tiny stars. I took the cup, feeling the ceramics heat seep into my palm. The coffee was bitter, the kind that burns the throat and wakes the mind. I lifted it to my lips, the steam fogging the visor, and let the bitterness settle, the taste of roasted beans anchoring me in the present. The sound of the engine's idle became a subtle drum, an undercurrent to the silence that wrapped us. "Your laptop's still at the bottom of the bag." Liam's tone shifted, curiosity edging his words. I dug the cracked device out. The screen cracked at one corner like a scar that refused to heal. "Yeah, it won't boot. I think the hard drive's fried." He leaned over, his elbow brushing the edge of the seat, the contact brief but enough to send a shiver up my arm. "Show me," he said, and I handed it to him. His fingers were calloused, the nails trimmed short, the scar on his thumb catching the light as he turned the laptop over. He examined it with a practiced eye, his breath warm against the glass. "Paperclip and patience," I muttered, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm a surgeon of broken tech." He let out a low chuckle that rumbled in his chest. "I've learned a thing or two about fixing things, especially when they're not supposed to be broken." He pulled a small, silver paperclip from his pocket, the metal glinting like a tiny blade. He slipped it into the laptop's port, his movements precise, his focus narrowing as if the world beyond the SUV ceased to exist. I watched his hands, noting the faint tremor at the base of his fingers. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, a tension that seemed to coil under his skin whenever he touched something fragile. When the screen flickered back to life, a soft green glow lit his face, the shadows retreating for a moment. "Booted," he said, voice soft, almost reverent. He handed the laptop back to me, the paperclip still lodged in his palm like a promise. "You're good with the grind." I smirked, the corners of my mouth lifting despite the cold. "I've survived night shifts, broken bones, and a father who vanished without a word. I can handle a busted laptop." He stared at me for a long second, his eyes narrowing just enough to make me feel seen. "What about the part that's not broken?" he asked, the question hanging in the stale air, the words layered with something he wasn't willing to name. The question hit a nerve I'd kept buried under layers of tuition bills and endless hospital rounds. I swallowed, felt the knot in my throat tighten, and let a dry laugh escape, the part that still wants to keep going, even when everything tells you to quit. His smile was thin, almost a mask, but his shoulders dropped a fraction, a surrender I hadn't expected. "I get that. I've watched people I cared about quit because they thought the world would be softer without them." The word softer lingered, and a stray thought slipped through my mind. The envelope he'd tucked into his bag earlier, the faint scent of ozone. I didn't ask about it. Instead, I turned my attention to the striped light that seeped through a crack in the garage door, casting bars across the floor. The shadows moved with the wind, a slow dance that made the concrete feel alive. A sudden clatter echoed from the far end of the garage, a metal cart toppling over, its wheels skidding on the icy floor. The noise sent a ripple of dust into the air, the particles catching the weak light like tiny fireflies. Liam's head snapped toward it, his jaw tightening. He stood, the leather seat groaning, and moved to the door, his silhouette a stark contrast against the flickering fluorescence. "Stay put," he said, his voice low but edged with command. I watched his shoulders broaden as he pushed the door open a crack, the wind howling in, carrying a spray of snow that clung to his forearm, turning the scar into a ghostly white line. He slipped out, the door sighing shut behind him. For a moment, the SUV felt empty, the heaters hum a lonely whisper. I pulled the hoodie tighter, feeling the wool brush my cheek, the texture a reminder of my mother's hands, of a life I kept protecting with every thread. The sound of his boots crunching on the snow-coated concrete reached my ears, each step resonating through the metal floor. He returned holding a small, mangled stray dog, its fur drenched, eyes wide with fear, a thin ribbon of red around its neck. The animal shivered, its breath forming tiny clouds that mingled with the steam rising from the coffee cup. My heart lurched as I reached out, my fingers brushing the dog's matted fur. "Poor thing," I whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. Liam knelt, his large hand gentle as he cupped the dog's head, the scar now barely visible under the damp fur. "Looks like it's been through a storm bigger than ours." He laughed, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the SUV's frame. He turned the dog toward me, letting its cold nose nuzzle my hand. I felt the animal's trembling wrists against my palm, the shock of its life force coursing through my skin. "It's a mutt," I said, trying to sound casual, but the tremor in my voice betrayed my own lingering fear of abandonment. "Can't leave it here." He nodded, his eyes softening. "We'll keep it warm for now. If we make it out, I'll find a place for it." The dog's whimper was a fragile sound, the kind that makes the air feel heavier. I placed a folded blanket from my bag over its shivering body, the wool rough against its skin. As I did, I felt the weight of my own blanket, the same one my mother had sewn for me years ago, now a bridge between past and present. "Thanks," I said, meeting Liam's gaze. The moment stretched, the silence thick with unspoken understanding. He seemed to recognize the parallel between the dog's fear and my own, a reflection of the vulnerability I guarded so tightly. He stepped back into the driver's seat, the door closing with a soft thump that sealed us again. The engine's low purr returned, the heater's warm breath filling the cabin. The dog curled up on the floor, its head tucked under my leg, the rhythmic rise and fall of its breathing a quiet metronome. We sat in a shared silence, the snow pounding the roof in a steady rhythm, each flake a reminder of the world outside that threatened to crush us. I traced the scar on his cheek with my eyes, the way it caught the light, the way it seemed to pulse with a hidden rhythm. I wondered what pain lay behind it, what loss he carried like a secret that refused to be spoken. "Ever feel like you're the only one watching the storm from inside?" he asked suddenly, his tone thoughtful. The question was directed at the sky beyond the glass, but the weight of it hit my chest. I smiled faintly, the corners of my mouth lifting in spite of the chill. "Every night shift feels like that. The world is a blur of sirens and flickering monitors, and I'm stuck in the middle waiting for something to change." He nodded, his hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the wolf head emblem glinting under his thumb. The emblem seemed to hum, a low vibration that I felt through the metal, as if it were a heartbeat syncing with his own. "Change is messy," he said, his voice tinged with something like admiration. "But sometimes you have to let the mess in to find what's real." I considered his words, the way his eyes lingered on the dog's small form, the way his jaw relaxed when the storm's roar faded into a distant howl. "What's real for you?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could weigh its implications. He stared at the road ahead, the windshield clouded with snow, the world reduced to a white canvas. "Family," he finally replied, the syllable heavy. "The pack. The ones I've lost and the ones I'm trying to protect." A soft thump echoed from the hallway beyond the SUV, a metal cart again shifting, this time accompanied by a faint, rhythmic clank that sounded like a lock turning. I turned my head toward the sound, the dog's ear perking up at the new noise. Liam's hand moved instinctively to the door, his fingers brushing the cold metal as he opened it a crack. A thin sliver of light spilled in, revealing a hallway lined with lockers, the metal doors cold to the touch. The air smelled of rust and pine, the latter coming from a small sapling he kept tucked in a corner, its fresh green needles a stark contrast to the gray concrete. A locker, he said, his voice barely louder than the wind. I keep a few things there, things that can't be left in the car. He gestured toward a locker at the far end, the numbers etched into the metal faded by years of use. I sensed a tension in his shoulders, a protective instinct flaring as if the locker held more than just tools. "What's inside?" I asked, curiosity pricking at the edges of my caution. He glanced back at me, the scar catching the dim light, and for a breath his eyes seemed to search mine. "A key," he answered, the word hanging between us like a promise and a threat, "and something that belongs to the pack." My mind raced, cataloging possibilities, documents, weapons, perhaps a relic. The thought of a pack, of something predatory hidden in plain sight, set a low warning in my gut, a reminder of the danger that lingered beyond the snow. Yet the fact that he was willing to share even a glimpse of that world with me, even if only in a vague way, felt like an invitation to step beyond the walls I'd built. "Can I see?" I asked, the question more a test than a request. I wanted to know if his willingness extended to trust, if the barrier between us could be lowered. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the lock, then he turned the key he'd handed me earlier, the metal cold and heavy, the teeth jagged like the teeth of a wolf. The lock clicked, a sound that resonated through the hallway, echoing off the concrete like a small, triumphant bark. The locker door swung open, revealing a small, velvet-lined case. Inside, nestled among folded documents, was a sleek, silver cuff, its surface etched with a subtle pattern of interlocking wolves. The cuff glinted, catching the flickering light, and a faint scent of pine seeped from within the case, more potent than his cologne, as if the metal absorbed the forest itself. Liam's eyes met mine, a storm of emotions flashing across his face: pride, fear, longing. "It's a mating token," he said softly, the words almost a whisper. "In our pack, it's a sign that someone has claimed you as their mate. It's ancient." The weight of the token settled in my palm, the metal cool against my skin. I felt the air thicken, the moment stretching as I processed the significance. My mind whirred with the implications. He was offering me a bond that went beyond the fleeting spark of attraction, a bond that could anchor me to a world I barely understood. "Liam," I began, the name tasting strange on my tongue. "What does that mean for you?" He swallowed, the sound barely audible over the wind. "It means I'm willing to risk everything for someone I trust," he said, the raw honesty in his voice cutting through the layers of his usual control, "even if that someone is a human who thinks she's just stuck in a garage." A pause settled, the car's heater hissing, the dog's soft whine punctuating the silence. I could hear the faint thrum of his heart through the seat, the rhythm steady, but underneath it was a tremor that mirrored my own, the one that rose whenever I thought about letting someone in. "I've spent my whole life making sure I'm the one who's needed," I confessed, the words slipping out before I could edit them. My voice trembled, the chill of the garage seeping into my bones. "I've never let anyone rely on me. It feels dangerous to think someone could rely on me, too." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, the scar on his cheek catching the light as he stared at me. "Maybe that's why we're here," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "The storm forced us to be close enough to see each other's scars. If we can survive this, maybe we can survive whatever comes after." The dog nudged my leg, its wet nose pressing against my shin, a reminder of the present, of the immediate need for warmth and safety. I placed my hand over its head, feeling the rapid thump of its heart, the same frantic beat I felt in my chest. "You're not the only one who's scared," I admitted, the admission a thin thread of honesty that tied us together. "I worry I'll become a burden, that if I let someone in, I'll end up taking more than I can give." Liam's gaze softened, a faint smile curving his lips as the scar glistened like a reminder of past pain. "Your burden is your strength," he said, his hand reaching over the console, his fingertips brushing the back of my hand. The contact was electric, the warmth of his skin seeping through the thin fabric of my hoodie, the sensation grounding me like the roots of a tree pushing into frozen soil. I think you're already giving more than you realize, he added, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. You've already saved me from walking alone this night. You've shown me that even a wolf can be tamed by someone who refuses to give up. The words settled a warm ember in the cold. I let my other hand rest on his forearm, feeling the tension in his muscles ease slightly under my touch. The moment felt fragile, like ice that could crack at any second, yet there was also an undercurrent of something stronger, trust building under the pressure of the storm, each shared glance and small act of kindness layering a foundation. A sudden crack of metal reverberated through the garage, the sound sharp and sudden, like an alarm. I flinched. The dog yelped, and Liam's eyes snapped to the far side where a figure emerged from the shadows, a hulking silhouette wrapped in a dark coat, the faint glint of a silver ring catching the light on his hand. Looks like we have company, Liam murmured, his voice tightening, the animal in him stirring just beneath the surface. He slipped the cuff from his pocket, the metal humming against his skin, and placed it back in the case, closing the locker with a decisive click. I stared at the newcomer, the tension in my gut rising like a tide. The stranger's eyes flicked between Liam and me, a flicker of recognition passing over his features. He raised a gloved hand and cupped his ear, as if listening for a hidden sound. Liam Cross, he said, his tone dripping with a mixture of accusation and curiosity. Mara sent me. She wants the human token. Talk to me before we make a mess of this. Liam's jaw clenched, his fingers white around the steering wheel. He glanced at me, a flicker of protectiveness flashing across his face, then turned his head back to the intruder. You're out of line, Mara, he replied, his voice a low growl, the wolves in his blood barely restrained. The tension in the cramped hallway grew thicker, the hum of the heater now sounding like a distant thunder. I felt the weight of the key still in my hand, the metal cold, an anchor to the locker, to the promise it held. My mind raced, trying to piece together the mysteries, the envelope in Liam's bag, the rival pack's intentions, the token's true power. All the while, the dog nudged my foot again, its fur damp, its eyes pleading for reassurance. I bent down, stroking its shivering back, the cheap wool of my hoodie creaking as I moved. The simple act of caring for that creature, of offering a small warmth in the midst of chaos, seemed to echo the larger dance we were forced into, two strangers bound by circumstance, learning to lean on one another. Liam's hand found mine again, his grip firm but not forceful, the scar on his cheek catching a stray beam of light as he whispered, "Stay close. We'll get through this." His words were a promise, a shield, a silent acknowledgement that his own fear of losing control, of being vulnerable, was now tangled with my own dread of abandonment. The sound of distant sirens rose beyond the garage walls, a low wail that seemed to echo the storm's fury. The snow outside intensified, the flakes turning into a blinding curtain that obscured everything beyond the concrete. In that whiteout, the world felt reduced to the SUV's interior, the locker, the dog's trembling breaths, and the two of us, caught in a fleeting yet profound moment of forced proximity. I squeezed his hand, the contact a quiet affirmation that despite the unknown swirling around us, Mara's threat, the secret envelope, the ancient token, I was willing to stay, to listen, to let the mess in and see where it might lead. The engine's low purr steadied, the heater's breath warmed the air, and for a heartbeat, the storm outside seemed a distant memory compared to the storm we were weathering together. The hallway lights sputtered, then steadied, casting the metal lockers in a thin, jaundiced glow. I pressed the trembling dog against my leg, its cold nose nudging my hand, and tried to focus on the humming of the heater instead of the pounding in my chest. Liam stood beside the open locker, the silver cuff glinting like a promise he'd just put back in its velvet cradle. He turned the key in the lock, then slipped the metal back into his pocket with a motion that felt too practiced for a night that should have been chaotic. "Looks like Mara's already here," he muttered, eyes flicking to the silhouette slipping through the frost-rimmed doorway. The man behind her wore a leather coat that smelled of motor oil and cheap whiskey. His hands were gloved, fingers twitching as if they'd just brushed an unseen trigger. "You coming with me?" he asked, voice low enough that only the two of us could hear over the distant howl of wind. I swallowed, feeling the dog's whimper vibrate through my thigh. The thought of being dragged back into the pack's politics made my throat tighten. My mind raced to the half-finished scholarship essay, the rent overdue, the way my mother's ceiling leaked every time it rained. I had spent years building a wall thick enough to keep anyone from seeing the hole where my father vanished. Now the wall trembled under the weight of his stare. I started, but the sound of metal scraping against concrete filled the pause, a reminder that the garage was still collapsing around us. My fingers clenched around the dog's fur, the texture of its damp coat grounding me. We should get out before they. Liam's jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek catching the dim light like a jagged line. He leaned forward, his shoulders bristling, and the scent of pine surged, almost overtaking the diesel that lingered in the air. If we leave now, they'll have the locker, the token, everything. He gestured to the case, the metal whispering against the locker door. You mean? My life, I said, the words sour on my tongue, more a shield than a confession. I could feel the old instinct spike, protect the fragile thread I'd been pulling for months, keep every ounce of independence intact. The thought of tying my fate to a wolf, of becoming a pawn in a centuries-old feud, sparked the familiar fire of abandonment fear. If I let him in, would he leave when the storm cleared, taking the pack's safety and leaving me with the cold concrete and a broken laptop? A sudden clank echoed from the far end of the hall, metal doors slamming, a door we hadn't noticed before now kicking open. A flash of red light spilled through a gap, revealing a security panel blinking alarm. Liam's hand twitched toward his belt, the outline of a concealed weapon disappearing into the shadows. Stay behind me, he growled, but his grip on the dog's collar loosened and the animal slipped, yelping as it hit the concrete. The sound cracked something inside me, a reminder that I was still the one who rescued, the one who shivered alone. I stepped back, the cold seeping through my boots, and the hallway seemed to close in, the lockers turning into walls of doubt. Maybe we're better off apart, I whispered, voice barely audible over the wind. You have your pack, I have my shift. I can't, my throat tightened around the last word, the promise of a future I'd been scrambling toward suddenly feeling like a trap. Liam stared at me, the wolf's low growl resonating in his throat, his eyes flickering between the token and the stray dog's trembling form. A beat passed, the storm outside howling louder, and the hallway lights dimmed again, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for what we'd both chosen to ignore. The snow had settled into a thick, muffling blanket by the time the alarm blared, its harsh trill cutting through the brittle quiet of the garage like a scream. I was already on my feet, the cold biting my bare ankles through the torn socks I'd slipped on in my haste. The stray dog still shivering, its ribs flaring with each rapid breath, was tangled in the cord of the broken fire extinguisher I'd used to create a steam wall earlier. Its wet fur brushed my calves as I knelt, my fingers fumbling with the tangled metal, the scent of pine from Liam's cologne mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of the extinguisher gas. Stay here, Liam's voice was low, a growl humming under each syllable as he slid the door open a crack wider. The wind slammed the doorway, an icy gust that carried the scent of rusted steel and the faint, distant howl of wolves I could feel in my bones but not see. He stepped out, his boot heels thudding against the concrete, the scar on his cheek catching a stray beam of the flickering fluorescent light, casting a thin line of amber across the torn fabric of his jacket. He moved toward the hallway where the locker door hung ajar, the metal hinges squeaking like a warning. The hallway stretched like a narrow canyon, rows of lockers lined the walls, each one a silent sentinel, their numbers faded by years of use. A low hum vibrated through the floor, the faint vibration of the building's old HVAC system trying to keep the cold at bay. As I pulled the dog free from the tangled cord, its cold nose nudged my palm, a rapid thump that echoed the frantic rhythm in my chest. I pressed the animal close, feeling its shivering body tremble against my thigh, the weight of its small, trembling life anchoring me to the present. Liam, I said, my voice barely more than a breath, what are they after? He didn't answer right away. He stared at the locker, his eyes narrowed, the flicker of his scar catching the light each time his eyelids fluttered. The locker door creaked, the sound amplified by the thinness of the concrete walls, and a gust of wind slipped through the crack, sending a flurry of snow into the hallway that danced like lazy ghosts across the metal floor. He reached into his pocket, the metal of the key clinking against the cuff he'd just slipped back into the case, the weight of it humming against his palm. Token, he murmured, the word a single, low note that seemed to vibrate through the metal lockers. Mara wants it because it's proof. Proof that I've claimed a human. She'll use it to force the pack into an alliance she can control. The words hit the air like splintered glass. I felt the scar on my own wrist, the one my mother had traced with a thin ribbon when I was a kid, a reminder of a promise I never kept, tightened as if it were a knot. The thought of being a pawn in a centuries-old feud made my breath catch, the chill of the air turning into a tightness in my throat. I could see the flicker of doubt across Liam's jaw, the thin line of muscle that tightened whenever his wolf side threatened to surface. Do you really think I'm just a token? I asked, the question more for myself than for him, my words slipping out with a tremor that made the dog whine softly. I'm not a piece on a board. He turned, the scar on his cheek catching a sliver of light that made it gleam like a fissure in stone. The scar was not just a mark but a map of a wound he'd hidden deep, the story of his brother's death that he kept locked behind the veneer of corporate cruelty. He took a step closer, the heat from his body radiating against the cold concrete, a subtle pressure that made the hair on my arms rise. He brushed a hand against my shoulder, the callus of his fingers pressing into my skin, the faint rasp of his breath on my neck sending a jolt through me that felt like both a warning and a promise. I don't want you to be a pawn, he said, his voice an odd mixture of steel and something softer, a whisper that seemed to be rehearsed and then torn apart at the edge. I want you to decide. The words hung in the hallway, the snow swirling outside the cracked window, the light from the street lamps painting the concrete in jagged, amber strokes. I could hear the distant rumble of sirens, the low growl of a police cruiser turning a corner, the faint echo of a crowd gathering somewhere beyond the garage walls. All of it pressed against the thin walls of the locker room, the sound amplifying my own heartbeat. I looked down at my hands, the veins standing out like rivers on a map, the skin pale from the cold. I lifted the dog's head, feeling its wet tongue loll over its teeth as it tried to lick the tears that had formed on my cheek. The animal's eyes, dark and unblinking, reflected the hallway lights, making them look like tiny amber orbs. In that moment, I realized the animal was more than a stray. It was a mirror of my own brokenness, a creature clinging to survival as fiercely as I did. Liam, I can't, I started, the words tangled with the taste of cold metal in my mouth, the sound of the heater humming low behind the lockers, the faint resonance of the building's old pipes. I can't let you risk everything for me, not when I'm barely holding onto my own life. His eyes sharpened, the wolf behind the human flashing for a heartbeat, the faint growl reverberating in his throat, the scent of pine intensifying as his instinct rose. He stepped back, his hand moving toward the locker again, the metal key turning with a soft click that sounded like a promise. He pulled out the velvet-lined case, the silver cuff catching the dim light, the interlocking wools etched into it shimmering like frozen water. He held it up, the metal cold against his palm, the weight of it a tangible presence. If I give you this, you'll have leverage. The pack can't take you without risking the token. It will give you some safety. I felt a sudden rush of wind as the door behind us shuddered, the thin sliver of a gap widening, a silhouette moving through it, a figure cloaked in black, the faint glint of a silver ring catching the light, the whisper of a breath that seemed to carry a hint of gasoline. Mara's presence was a ghost in the hallway, a breath of cold that cut through the warm air of the locker. Mara's voice cut through the thud of my racing heart, smooth and sharp like a glass shard. Liam, you're being foolish. Give me the token and I'll spare the human. I'll make sure the pack never discovers what you're hiding. Liam's jaw clenched, the scar briefly flaring a brighter red as if the blood beneath the skin wanted to surface. A low, guttural sound escaped him, his teeth pressing together, his shoulders tightening like a coiled spring. I could see the muscles in his neck contract, the furrowed lines on his brow deepening. The tension in his shoulders made the leather of his jacket creak as he shifted his weight, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the metallic tang of the locker door. "Whatever you do," I whispered, my voice barely audible under the gust of wind that slipped through the cracked door, "I'm not a piece. I'm not yours to claim." He stared at me, the wolf in his eyes flickering, the human part of him holding a careful balance. He reached out, his fingers brushing my cheek, the callous skin light against my soft cheek, the contrast sending another jolt through me. He pressed a thumb against the scar on my wrist, the gentle pressure like a promise that he could hear the echo of my own fear of abandonment, fear of being a burden without needing words. "Then let us choose together," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the concrete, "not because they force us, but because we decide to stand." The hallway lights flickered, the fluorescent tubes sputtering a brief flash before settling into a steadier glow. The stray dog's whine grew louder, a tiny sound that cut through the tension like a needle. I tucked the animal closer, feeling its damp fur against my calves, the heat of its body seeping into my own, grounding me. The dog's breathing was steady now, a rhythmic rise and fall that seemed to sync with the pulse I could barely hear in my ears. Mara's silhouette lingered at the doorway, the strange ring on her hand catching the light, the faint scent of motor oil and cheap whiskey trailing behind her like a warning. She didn't move, the snow swirling in the cracked glass behind her, creating a shroud of white that seemed to protect her from being fully seen. "You'll regret this, Liam," Mara said, her tone almost affectionate, as if she were speaking to an old friend. "Human tokens are fragile. They break under pressure. You'll see that soon enough." Liam's eyes narrowed, the wolf in him snarling softly, his teeth flashing as a low growl built under his skin. He tightened his grip on the case, the silver cuff glinting with a cold fire, his hands' knuckles turning white. I could feel the vibrations through the metal, the subtle tremor in his fingers that spoke more than his words. "Maybe," I said, my voice gaining a steadier edge, "maybe we both need to stop seeing this as a transaction. Maybe we can try to be something else." The word else hung in the air, a fragile hope that seemed to push against the walls of the locker room. He turned his gaze to the dog, the animal's eyes wide, reflecting the amber hue of the lights. A soft chuckle escaped him, half bitter, half amused. "You saved a dog, Ava. You already know what it feels like to protect something you didn't choose." The bark of the dog sharp, tiny cut through the haze, its small body shaking as it licked the back of my hand. I felt a tiny tear escape, the cold sliding down my cheek, the salt stinging my skin. The tears were not simply from fear. They carried the weight of years spent watching my mother struggle alone, the silent promise I made to never be a burden, the lingering disappointment of a father who vanished. Liam's hand hovered over my shoulder, then slipped down to rest at the small of my back, his fingers tracing a line down my spine, the pressure firm yet not oppressive. The warmth of his palm seeped through the thin fabric of my hoodie, a subtle heat that seemed to thaw the ice that had built up around my heart. "You've always been good at fixing broken things," he said, his voice softer now, almost a murmur against the hum of the building. "But you don't have to do it alone. Let me help you with the token. Let me help you keep it safe, not because I own it, but because I care about the person who holds it." A breath escaped me, the sound mingling with the hiss of the heating system, the faint echo of distant sirens. I could hear the faint thump of a patrol car's engine outside, the snow brushing the tires, the low thrum of police radios. The thought of being vulnerable, of letting him in, was terrifying, but the image of the dog's trembling form, the scar on his cheek, the token that symbolized an ancient promise, all converged into a single point of clarity. I realized that my fear of being a burden had always been a mask for a deeper fear of being left behind, abandoned like my father's silhouette in the night. And Liam's fear of losing control, of being exposed, was a mask for his dread of losing the few people who mattered, the pack he never truly trusted. "Fine," I whispered, the word barely louder than the snarl of the wind against the broken garage door. "Let's keep the token together, not as a claim, but as a pact." He smiled then, a thin line that didn't reach his eyes at first, then slowly widened, the tension easing from his shoulders like a rope being loosened. He reached into the case, pulling out the silver cuff, its surface cool against his palm. He placed it on the table, a metal locker shelf, its weight a silent thrum against the concrete. "You'll need a way to protect it. I can give you a safe place within the pack's network," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "a room we can access only with a code I'll share, and if the pack comes after you, I'll be there." The dog nudged my leg again, its wet nose cold against my skin, the tiny whine of its breath a persistent reminder of the present. I rubbed its ears, feeling the damp fur under my fingertips, the sensation grounding me. The sound of my own breath, shallow and ragged, blended with the distant howl of wind, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the building itself. A sudden thud reverberated from the far end of the hallway, a heavy metal crate falling onto the concrete, the clang echoing like a gunshot. The sound startled the dog, causing it to let out a higher-pitched whine, and the echo seemed to rattle the lockers, making the metal doors shiver. Mara's silhouette moved a fraction, the faint ring on her hand catching the light, a thin smile curling at the corner of her mouth. "You really think you can outrun the pack's history?" she asked, the tone almost affectionate, as if reminiscing about an old rivalry. Liam stepped forward, his posture rigid, the scar on his cheek glinting like a warning. He placed his hand on the metal case, the pressure steady, his knuckles crushing the silver cuff as if testing its strength. "I'm not outrunning anything," he said, his voice a low, measured growl. "I'm confronting it." The hallway seemed to hold its breath, the fluorescent lights flickering once more before settling into a steady glow. I felt the dog's body relax against my leg, its breath slowing, matching the rhythm of my own breathing. The tension in my chest loosened a little, as if each exhale released a thread of the fear that had bound me for so long. I looked up at Liam, the scar now a permanent part of his visage, the wolf in him restrained but ever present. His eyes, dark and intense, held a glimmer of something I hadn't seen before, vulnerability, tangled with resolve. He reached out, his fingers brushing the back of my hand, the calloused tips making a faint imprint on my skin, a silent acknowledgement that we were now sharing more than a forced proximity, we were choosing a shared path. The lock on the locker door clicked open, revealing the empty space inside, the metal walls reflecting our faces in dim light. He placed the cuff inside, the metal joining the concrete in a quiet communion. The act felt like a promise, a pact sealed not by circumstance but by the willingness to forge it together. A sudden crack of thunder rumbled from the storm outside, the sound reverberating through the thin walls, the vibrations traveling through the floorboards, reminding us that the world beyond this hallway was still chaotic, still dangerous. Yet inside, a strange calm settled, a fragile peace built on the scaffolding of choices we made in the moment. "I'll teach you the code," Liam said, his voice softer now, each syllable measured, "and I'll help you fix that laptop. We both have things to fix." I smiled, a small, genuine curve that reached my eyes, the first in hours that didn't mask a hidden alarm. "And I'll teach you how to make coffee that doesn't taste like burnt diesel," I replied, the sarcasm in my tone tinged with a new lightness. He laughed, a low, genuine sound that seemed to vibrate through the metal lockers, the laugh cracking the lingering tension. The dog barked softly, a tiny sound that felt like a celebration. The hallway lights hummed, the faint smell of pine from his cologne mixing with the faint scent of diesel and the sweet, damp aroma of the dog's fur. A faint crackle from the security panel in the far corner hinted at a dormant alarm still waiting to be triggered, a reminder that the external threat still lingered, a loop yet unresolved. I pressed my palm against the metal locker door, feeling the vibrations travel up my arm, grounding me in this moment, the promise of a shared future, the token now safely stored, the dog nestled against my leg, Liam's hand still resting gently on my back. It all felt like a fragile architecture we were building together, piece by piece, despite the storm raging outside and the shadow of Mara lingering in the doorway. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice steadier, the steel of my resolve tempered with a newfound willingness to trust. Liam nodded, the scar on his cheek catching a final flash of light as he stepped toward the door, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of the hallway. He turned once, his gaze meeting mine, a quiet promise passing between us without words. We would stay, we would fight, we would move forward not because the storm forced us, but because we chose to. The door swung open, the wind howling in, the snow swirling like a living thing, and we stepped into the white chaos together, the dog at our heels, the token secured, the future uncertain, but our commitment renewed. The hallway lights sputtered once more, then steadied, casting a thin amber over the metal lockers, the stray dog's ragged breathing the only rhythm breaking the silence. I stared at the silver cuff perched on the cracked shelf, its surface catching the flicker of a faulty bulb, and my fingers tightened around the strap of my backpack, the rough canvas biting into my forearm. "Liam," I said, my voice a low rasp that seemed to echo off the concrete, "we can't keep playing keep away with this." The words left my throat like a cold breath, and I could smell the pine from his cologne mingling with the metallic tang of the locker's rusted hinges. He stood opposite me, his back against the steel door, the scar on his cheek illuminated by a stray ray that made it look like a fresh cut. The scar glimmered, and for a moment I thought I could see the faint outline of a broken chain where the flesh met bone. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his hand drifted to the edge of the locker, fingertips grazing the cold metal as if searching for a hidden latch. "The token isn't just a promise," he said finally, his voice low enough that the hum of the heating system seemed louder than his words. "It's a liability. If Mara gets it, the whole pack could crumble. I can't let that happen." A sudden clank sounded from deeper in the garage, a metal cart being pulled across the floor, the wheels squealing against a patch of ice. The stray dog whined, its ears twitching toward the noise, and I felt the familiar sting of my own fear of being dragged into a war I didn't understand. My mind flicked to the scholarship deadline, to the rent notice waiting on my mother's kitchen table, to the empty apartment with a ceiling that leaks like a broken promise. I'd built a wall thick enough to keep everyone out. Now that wall seemed to crumble under the weight of his secret. "You're willing to risk everything for a token I barely understand," I whispered, the words thin as the paper that had once held my scholarship application. I glanced down at the dog, its wet fur soaking through the thin blanket I'd wrapped around it, the scent of pine and damp fur filling my nose. I remembered the way I'd cradled it when we first found it, how its tremors matched the tremor in my own chest. His jaw tightened, the muscle in his neck bulging like a rope being pulled taut. "It's not just a token, Ava. It's the only thing that keeps the pack together. If I lose it, the wolves will turn on each other and the humans will pay." He made a sweeping gesture toward the hallway, where the faint outline of a security panel glowed red, a reminder that the building's alarm system still held its breath, waiting for a trigger. An edge of panic rose in me, not for the pack, but for the certainty that I was just a pawn in a game that spanned centuries. My fingers brushed the strap of my backpack again, feeling the weight of the half-finished chemistry assignment inside, the crinkled pages that held the promise of a future I'd clawed toward. I could hear the distant wail of a police siren, its high pitch slicing through the muffled clangs of the garage, a sound that always made my mother's hands tremble in the kitchen. "Liam, you said you wanted to protect me," I said, each syllable a small step across a frozen lake, "but you're keeping me locked in a secret I can't grasp." I can't be the prize you hide in a locker and then hand to a pack that will tear me apart. My breath fogged the air near the locker, the condensation swirling like the doubts that had always lived in the back of my mind. His eyes flickered, a flash of something feral behind the human surface, and I sensed the tension in his shoulders loosen for a heartbeat before snapping back like a spring. He reached out, his hand hovering over my shoulder, the calloused fingertips brushing the wool of my hoodie. The contact was electric, a jolt that traveled down my spine, but instead of grounding me, it ignited a surge of terror. I could feel the scar on his cheek throb, as if his own pain was sinking with mine. Nobody's ever trusted me, he said, the words tasting like ash. Every time I let someone close, they end up broken. He clenched his fist, the metal cuff pressing into his palm, the interlocking wolves etched into the silver catching the light, a quiet reminder of the legacy he carried. I remembered the night my father walked out, the sound of his car door slamming shut behind him, the echo that lingered in my hallway for years. I'd told myself that I could never depend on anyone, that I would be the one who held everything together. The lie had been my armor, my excuse for never letting anyone see the hole where he'd left a void. Now, faced with the rawness of his confession, the armor cracked. I've spent my whole life proving I don't need anyone, I said, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. And you've built a throne of power on the backs of those who owe you. I could hear the faint hiss of the heater, the soft crackle of the exhaust pipe outside, the world narrowing to the space between us and the metal door. He stepped back, the scar catching the light again, and for a second I thought I saw a flicker of something else, perhaps a memory of his brother, the one whose death had set this whole chain of loyalty into motion. Something shifted in the hallway, a distant clang, the sound of a locker being forced open somewhere we couldn't see, the low thrum of an unseen engine. The dog barked, a sharp yelp that seemed to pierce the tension like a needle. Then maybe you're right, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that howled through the cracked garage doors. Maybe I'm the one who can't hold on. He turned away, his silhouette merging with the shadows cast by the flickering light, and I felt the bitter sting of the cold air hit my cheek, as if the night itself were scraping at the thin skin of my resolve. The hallway door burst open with a sudden jolt, the metal panel swinging wide to reveal a flash of red police lights slicing through the snow-bled darkness outside. A squad car screeched to a halt, the blare of its siren cutting through the building's roar. I heard the rapid footsteps of officers, the clang of their boots against the concrete, a rhythm that spoke of authority and impending arrest. Mara's silhouette slipped through the doorway behind them, her coat catching the light of the police siren, the silver ring on her finger glinting like a promise unkept. She stared at Liam, her eyes narrowing, a smile curving her lips like a blade about to drop. "You always did love dramatic exits," she said, voice smooth as the gasoline she must have breathed. "I'll take the token, Liam. You'll have your pack and I'll have the leverage." Liam's shoulders rose, his breath catching like a wolf caught in a trap. He turned his head toward me, his eyes an ocean of conflict. For a heartbeat I thought he might reach out, bridge the distance, but instead his hand fell to the locker door, fingers closing around the handle with a deliberate, almost ceremonial grip. He pulled it open, the metal squeal echoing like a verdict. The cuff lay there, cold and untouched, a silent witness to the choices about to be made. I felt the dog's body tremble against my leg, its whine rising to a higher pitch, and I realized I was holding a piece of his world, one that could be ripped away in an instant. "Go," I heard myself say, the single word a crack in the ice surrounding my heart. "If you're going to keep the pack together, you need to do it without me." He stared at me, the scar on his cheek catching the final flash of light, the wolves in his eyes flickering like dying embers. A low growl rose in his throat, reverberating through his chest, but it was swallowed by the screech of the police radio, the urgent commands cutting through the hallway. "Liam, police," an officer shouted, his flashlight sweeping across the lockers, the beam hitting the silver cuff and making it shine like a beacon. "Step away from the vehicle." Liam's jaw clenched, and I could see his hand twitch toward the case hidden beneath his jacket. The metal of the hidden weapon inside, a promise of protection he would never use now. He hesitated, then stepped back, the weight of his pack, both literal and figurative, pulling him toward the doorway. "The token stays here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were speaking to the ghost of his brother. "You'll have to find another way, Ava." He turned, the scar catching the waning light one last time, a crimson line that seemed to trace the path he'd chosen. I watched him move toward the exit, the snow swirling around his boots, the police lights painting his silhouette in red and blue. The dog whined, its body shaking, and I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the storm outside, a hollow ache spreading from my chest to my fingertips. My mind raced. What would happen to the pack without me? Where would the token end up? And behind the flashing lights, a shadow moved in the periphery, a figure in a dark coat watching the scene unfold, his eyes glinting with a hunger I didn't yet understand. The hallway door slammed shut behind the officers, the metal clang reverberating through the lockers. The stray dog bolted, slipping through the narrow gap between the doors, its paws leaving prints in the snow-slick floor. I lunged after it, the wool of my hoodie snagging on a rusted pipe, the rough texture pulling at my skin like a reminder of the life I'd left behind. My breath hitched as I reached the dog's shaking form, cradling it in my arms, its damp fur soaking through my shirt. I could feel the rapid thump of its heart against my own, a rhythm that mirrored the frantic beat I'd tried to drown out for years. Around us, the hallway was empty, but for the faint hum of the heating system and the distant echo of police radios. The silver cuff lay untouched on the shelf, a glint of promise left behind. I stood there, the dog shivering in my embrace, the cold seeping through the soles of my boots, and I realized the walls I'd built weren't just around me, they were now around him, too. The lie I'd lived by, that I could never be a burden, had become the very thing that tore him away. Liam's fear of losing control had forced him to protect his pack at the cost of our bond, and my own fear of abandonment had made me push him to that very point. A distant howl rose above the sirens, a wolf's mournful cry that seemed to come from the very walls. I clutched the dog tighter, the scent of pine and diesel mingling with the bitter taste of cold metal on my tongue, and watched the door swing shut, Liam's silhouette vanishing into the white blur outside. The hallway lights flickered one last time, then steadied, bathing the metal lockers in a cold, indifferent glow. I pressed the dog's head against my chest, feeling its breath warm against my skin, and the weight of the silver cuff on the shelf felt like an accusation I could not answer. The storm outside raged on, but the storm inside my chest had settled into a hollow silence, the promise of a future together shattered by the fear we'd both been too stubborn to admit. I stepped out of the garage into the snowfall, the world flattened to a white hush that seemed to swallow any sound but the crunch of my boots on the icy concrete. The panes of the building's broken doors rattled with each gust, sending a spray of cold that clung to my skin like static. My hoodie, heavy with the damp from the night's chill, pressed against my shoulders, and the faint scent of pine on my sleeve reminded me of Liam's cologne, an unwanted reminder that I'd been holding onto something I didn't understand. My breath formed a thin cloud that disappeared before it could settle, and I watched it disperse, thinking of how quickly I could let go of the past if I just focused on the present. The street was deserted, the only illumination a flickering street lamp whose amber glow threw long shadows across the snow. I pulled the straps of my backpack tighter, feeling the weight of the cracked laptop inside, a small, broken thing that felt like a mirror of my own fractured plans. The scholarship deadline loomed in my mind, a ticking clock that sounded louder than the distant howl of a police siren. I turned toward the university's science building, its brick facade darkened by the storm, and forced myself to walk, each step a deliberate act of moving forward without looking back. The wind brushed my cheek, icy and sharp, and I caught the faint metallic tang of the city's underground heating pipes leaking steam onto the sidewalk. My fingers tightened around the cuff of my hoodie, the little knot I'd tied for good luck at birth. My mother's habit of tying a loop in my cord to keep me from slipping away now feeling like a restraint I'd chosen. I recognized that the knot was a habit I'd built to keep control, an invisible rope tightening each time I feared abandonment. Ahead, the building's main entrance was half blocked by a fallen security sign, its plastic warped and half torn open. I hesitated, the door's faint squeal echoing my own uncertainty. The lock was ajar, a gap just wide enough for the hand that dared to slip inside. I stared at it, the cold seeping into my fingers, and realized I could either force my way in or wait for the crowd that would never come. I chose the former, pushing the door with a surge of stubbornness I'd always used to prove I didn't need anyone's help. Inside, the hallway was a maze of fluorescent lights flickering like nervous fireflies. The scent of cleaning chemicals cut through the stale air, and the faint hum of the building's old ventilation system ticked against my nerves. I headed toward the computer lab, passing by a wall of lockers where a thin line of frost traced the metal doors. One locker, number 27, was slightly ajar, its interior dark except for a faint glint, something metallic, half covered by a folded newspaper. I paused, curiosity sparking, but my focus stayed on the deadline. I slipped past, the cold metal of the locker's edge brushing my palm, a reminder that unseen things could slip through cracks if I let them. At the lab, the room was littered with malfunctioning servers and the low whir of fans fighting a losing battle against the storm's cold. I set my bag down, the laptop's cracked screen reflecting my tired eyes. The power flickered and the emergency backup kicked in with a soft buzz, casting the room in a dim, greenish glow. I opened the laptop, the familiar click of the hinge feeling like a second-hand heartbeat. The screen stayed black. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, each key a tiny cliff I'd have to climb. I sighed, the sound raw in the quiet, and remembered the paperclip Liam had given me. I dug into my pocket, feeling the cool metal of the paperclip against my skin, and twisted it into the hard drive port. The machine whirred, a reluctant growl, and the screen flickered to life, displaying a corrupted file. I stared at the garbled text, the words jumbling together like the thoughts I kept shoving down. I realized the file was a draft of my scholarship essay, half written, half abandoned when I chose to work another night shift. My heart tightened, and I felt the old ache of guilt rise, a familiar tremor that always followed the thought of letting a project slip. I took a breath, feeling the cold air sting my lungs, and typed, forcing each sentence out like a promise to myself that I would no longer sacrifice my future for someone else's expectations. As the words formed, a gentle knock echoed from the hallway, soft, deliberate, as if someone else was trying to open a door without breaking the silence. I froze, the keyboard stilled under my fingers, and listened. The knock repeated, then a muffled shout from somewhere down the corridor, a voice calling help. Someone. The tone was urgent, but I couldn't tell if it was a man's or a woman's. My mind raced. If I stayed, I might be the one to help, but the essay needed to be finished. I felt the tug of responsibility to the unknown stranger clash with the tug of my own need to succeed. I glanced at the clock on the wall, the minute hand ticked past 3:12, and I realized the deadline was less than an hour away. I made a choice. I would not let fear decide for me again. I pushed the laptop closed, the screen dimming into black, and lifted my bag, the weight of the notebook inside reminding me of the hours I'd spent nursing patients while my own dreams lay dormant. I walked toward the hallway, the cold metal of the door handle biting my palm, and opened it just enough to peek out. The hallway was a blur of white light, the snow swirling inside the broken doors like a living curtain. At the far end, a figure huddled near a collapsed security console, a man in a dark coat clutching a metal case, his breath fogging in the air. He looked up, his eyes wide with panic, and I saw the glint of a silver ring on his finger, Mara's signature. He muttered something about a token, the word snapping in the cold like a cracked whip, and I caught the faint smell of gasoline on his coat. My stomach tightened again, but this time it was not fear of abandonment, It was a primal reaction to danger, a reminder that I could act without being swept up in his storm. I stepped forward, the crunch of my boots echoing in the empty corridor, and called out, "Are you okay?" The man turned, surprise flickering across his face, then relief as he saw another human. He dropped the case, the metal clanking against the floor, and I knelt to open it. Inside lay a battered folder, its edges frayed, filled with documents, blueprints, legal papers, and a photograph of a young woman with a scar across her cheek. The image sent a shiver through me. It was Liam, younger, his eyes still bright, before the pack's blood had hardened his stare. The photograph was tucked between pages marked Mara, assets. My mind raced. Was this evidence of a larger power play? Was the token's true purpose more than a claim? I closed the case, my fingers lingering on the metal, feeling its cold weight. The stranger, Mara's emissary, looked at me, his gaze hard, the ring catching the dim light. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, his voice low as the wind outside. I swallowed, the taste of metal in my mouth, and replied, "I'm not here for you." The words felt like a shield I'd built without knowing it. He snorted, the sound dry, and stepped back, glancing toward the exit where police lights flickered in the distance, their sirens a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the concrete. I could hear the distant chatter of officers, the clatter of their radios, and I felt the strange calm of a storm passing through me. I realized I could choose to stay and be drawn into the pack's politics, or I could walk away, sealing the case, and finish my essay. I rose, the case heavy in my hands, and made the decision to close this chapter literally and figuratively. I carried the case out into the snow, the cold biting my cheeks, the metal ringing against my palm with each step. The hallway's broken door swung shut behind me with a resonant clang, sealing the secret inside. I stopped at the edge of the parking lot, where the storm's wind swirled white dust around my boots, and I stared at the silver ring embedded in the frost on the lamppost. It glinted, a tiny promise of danger that I could choose not to follow. I tucked the case into my bag, the folder's loose pages rustling, and felt the first genuine breath of relief, my own breath, not one forced to match another's rhythm. Later, back in my cramped dorm, I spread the essay outline across my desk, the lamp's warm glow spilling amber onto the paper. The notebook's pages felt rough under my fingertips, each grain a reminder of the path I'd walked. I began to write, not to impress a committee, but to prove to myself that I could finish what I'd started. The words flowed, unfiltered, the sentences jagged at first, then smoothing as if a knot was being untied. I wrote about the night's storm, about the feel of pine on a leather seat, about the stray dog's trembling body, details that anchored me to the moment without needing anyone else's validation. The essay grew, and with each paragraph I sensed my old habit of sacrificing my own goals for others loosening. The fear that love would distract me faded, replaced by the quiet certainty that I could protect myself without becoming a burden. The storm outside had passed, but the wind still whispered through the cracked window, a reminder that change, like weather, could be sudden and relentless. I closed the notebook, the pen resting lightly on the page, and felt the scar on my wrist, a faint line from a childhood bandage, pulsate as if acknowledging the new rhythm I'd found within myself. Liam paced the dim hallway of his family's corporate office, the polished marble floor cold beneath his shoes, each step echoing a rhythm he'd long ignored. The night's snowstorm had cleared, but the panic inside him lingered, a low growl that resonated through his ribs. He stared at the empty conference room table, the glass surface reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights like shards of ice. The silver cuff lay in his palm, its interlocking wolves catching the light, and he felt the weight of the token's promise pressing against his skin, not as a claim but as a reminder of his own brokenness. He turned to the massive wall of windows that looked out onto the city's skyline, the towers piercing the winter sky like jagged teeth. The air smelled of exhaust and rain-soaked concrete, a familiar scent that always made him think of the streets he'd once roamed as a lone alpha. He inhaled, the cold air biting his throat, and felt a flash of his brother's death, blood spattered on the office floor, the echo of a howl that never faded. The memory surged, and his jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek pulsing as if it were a living vein. He walked to his office, the heavy oak door creaking shut behind him. The room was sparse, a sturdy desk, a leather chair, and a locked safe embedded in the wall. He slipped a key into the lock, the click resonating like a gunshot in the stillness. Inside, a stack of legal documents lay, each page marked with the Cross Industries seal. He grabbed a folder titled Mara, Negotiations, its edges frayed, and flipped through. The papers detailed an upcoming merger, vague clauses about human integration and pack stability. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, a dread that he was being pulled into a game he never wanted to play. He placed the folder down and stared at the old photograph on his desk, him and his brother, arms around each other, smiling under a canopy of autumn leaves. He ran a thumb over the scar on his brother's cheek, the same line that now mirrored his own. The image was a loop he'd never closed. He'd always blamed himself for not protecting his brother. For the moment he chose power over family, he realized the power he wielded now was built on that same mistake, a fortress of control erected to hide his fear of loss. He moved to the window, the city lights glimmering like distant fireflies. The wind rattled the glass, a soft hiss that reminded him of the night they'd been forced into the garage, the smell of pine and diesel mixing with his breath. He felt the lingering heat of the SUV seat, the faint imprint of Ava's hand on his arm. He remembered the way she'd offered a paperclip, how his jaw had softened when she laughed at his corporate jargon. He sensed the old habit stirring, protecting others by keeping them at arm's length, the way he'd kept Ava out of his world while offering her safety. He turned away, the pull of his duty tugging at him, but his mind drifted to the stray dog he'd rescued, a small, shivering thing that had sought him out in the hallway. He could still feel its wet nose against his leg, the tremor of its body as if it were a living embodiment of his own wounded instincts. He thought of the way the dog had looked at him, eyes filled with silent pleading, and realized he'd been using the pack's rules to justify not confronting his own vulnerability. He reached for his phone, the screen lighting up his face with a soft blue glow. A text buzzed, "Need to talk, Sierra, 223. The name belonged to an old pack member, a former lieutenant who'd left after the brother's death, rumored to be aligning with Mara. He felt the old sting of betrayal, the urge to dismiss the message as another threat, yet a new part of him, still raw, still unsure, wanted to understand why she had left, what she feared, what she might still need from him. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the reply, the decision hanging like a fragile icicle. He finally typed, "Meet at the old dock, 8 p.m. The words felt like a bridge he'd not intended to build, a step toward confronting the past without the excuse of a storm. He placed the phone down, the metal casing cold against his palm, and stared at his reflection in the darkened window. The scar on his cheek caught the city's neon, a scar that told a story of loss, of an unspoken promise to never be vulnerable again. He saw his own breath fog the glass, each exhale a reminder that even the strongest wolves needed air. He clenched his fists, the veins in his forearms popping, then slowly released, feeling the tension in his shoulders lessen. He pulled the silver cuff from his pocket, the metal cool against his skin, and slipped it onto his wrist, not as a token of claim but as a reminder that he could choose to wear his identity on his own terms. He turned back to the desk, opened the safe, and took out a small, leather-bound journal he'd kept hidden for years. The pages were blank, waiting. He lifted the pen, the tip gleaming, and wrote the first line, "I am not a wolf who must always lead. I am also the one who can be led." The ink smelled faintly of iron, a scent that made him think of the blood on his brother's shirt, but also of the blood he'd shed in battle. He felt a tear sting his eye, not from sorrow, but from a cracked barrier finally giving way. As the night deepened, the city's hum a low murmur. He sat alone, the storm outside a distant memory. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with rivalry and secrets. Mara's name still whispered in the shadows, the token still coveted, his pack still wary, but for the first time, he felt the space inside himself widen, a room where he could be both protector and someone who needed protection. He closed the journal, the soft thud echoing like a promise kept, and stood, the silver cuff glinting as he walked toward the elevator, ready to meet the future on his own terms. Ava stepped into the quiet stairwell of the old parking garage, the concrete walls still smelling of diesel and pine. The faint hum of the building's backup generator throbbed through the metal rail, matching the rapid beat in her chest. She lifted her backpack, feeling the familiar weight of the cracked laptop and the paperclip Liam had given her, and paused at the rusted door that led to the service corridor. A flicker of amber light leaked through the crack, casting a thin rectangle on the floor where a single scuff mark glistened like a breadcrumb. She pushed the door open and heard the soft scrape of shoes on the wet cement. Liam stood there, his coat pulled tight against the cold, the silver cuff glinting under the low bulb. His hand rested on the handle of a small metal case, the same one they had once hid in the locker. The scar on his cheek caught the light, a pale line that seemed less a wound and more a map of where he had chosen to carry his pain. "Thought you'll disappear with the token," he said, voice low, the pine scent of his cologne mingling with the metallic tang of the garage. He gestured to the case, then to the stray dog curled on the floor, its fur still damp from the earlier steam wall. The dog lifted its head, eyes bright, and nudged Ava's shoe with a wet nose. Ava reached down, the dog's breath warm against her palm, and felt the familiar surge of protectiveness that had once rotted into selfishness. "I'm not the one who needs rescuing," she replied, slipping a paperclip into the dog's collar, "but I can't let you finish this alone." Liam's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck rippling as he stepped closer. He slid the cuff from his wrist, placed it on the metal shelf, and opened the case. Inside lay a folded map of the city's underground tunnels, a set of encrypted files, and a sealed envelope stamped with the Cross Industries seal. He handed the envelope to Ava without a word. Her fingers brushed the cold paper, and she sensed the faint smell of ozone that hinted at something dangerous hidden within. "You still have that envelope from the meeting with Sierra," she whispered, recalling the whispered phone call today.